All right. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for joining us on our last virtual session of MCIC 2022. It's been a very busy month, so I'm sad that we are closing out, but also looking forward to it. So I appreciate you all being here for this last one. We are joined by Dr. Edina Haslauer and Dr. Douglas Adams. The session tonight is Banned and Challenged Books in U.S. Schools, Past and Present Practices. We do have a few community standards that we'd just like to point out for folks. I won't read them all in this moment, but I will link them in the chat. Just to point out that we do want to make sure we're having respectful dialogue tonight and good civil discourse. If there is content that you would like to take notes on, you're welcome to do that, but please get consent from our presenters before taking screenshots or sharing their content. We want to honor the experts we have in the room and make sure that we are giving credit where credit is due. All of our sessions are using live closed captioning. You can see, hopefully at the bottom of your screen, a CC button or the more with the 3 dots, and you should be able to hit enable subtitles or view live transcript. Most of the MCIC sessions have been recorded and will be recorded, just as this one is now tonight. This is being done so that way sessions are more accessible to folks who may not be able to attend our live sessions. The recording links are posted in Whova and can be accessed on the agenda page. You can also use your phone and scan this nifty little QR code to get to our YouTube page, and I will also link that in the chat once we get started. If you have any questions, I will be available here in the background, as well as Edina, Doug, and Natasha. So please feel free to message one of us. I will also be monitoring the campus climate email. So if any questions or concerns come up, I'm happy to assist there. All right, so our session tonight, Banned and Challenged Books in the U.S. Schools, Past and Present Practices. This presentation will investigate the history of banning books in the United States and explore the ways in which this practice became prevalent in the last few years. After a short historical review, the presenters will introduce a few books that are commonly challenged in K-12 schools. We will also provide an analysis of how these books could support the development of a multicultural society. And with that, I will hand it over to our presenters. Thanks so much.
So just 1 second here. Okay, so welcome everybody. Okay, I am Dr. Edina Haslauer from the School of Education, and I have here with me.
I'm Doug Adams, also from the School of Education.
And we are happy to be here, and we are going to talk about banned and challenged books in the United States. A short presentation about the past, and then a longer presentation about current practices.
So we'd like to start off with the Galileo affair in the 17th century, which is the Inquisition of Galileo for instilling a heliocentric model of the universe that the Vatican did not pardon until 1992. And so this idea around banning ideas and banning books is not necessarily new within the context of the, I guess, within European and American models. But we'd like to fast forward here to the United States. I picked the 1925 State of Tennessee versus John Scopes, not because it's the first one in the United States, it's definitely not, but the sort of idea around where I'm from and the discussion around the banning of Darwin's theory of evolution in Tennessee public schools. And we see here an image from Dayton, Tennessee, where this trial was taking place between William James Bryan, who represented the state of Tennessee, who was 1898 presidential hopeful, who lost to President William McKinley, and then Clarence Darrow, who was the founder of the ACLU on the behalf of John Scopes, who was a substitute teacher that taught Darwin's theory of evolution in schools. And then, so I'd also like to put this in context also in Tennessee, because that is the state in which I'm from, and thinking about the idea around banned books is something that happens in other places and not in our own hometowns, but in my own hometown of Mice and Men, John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men was banned when I was in high school. because of the vulgar language. And that's something that we will be discussing as to why, like, who gets to decide what is vulgar, who gets to decide what is not, what is included and what is not.
And with that past introduction, we are going to turn to present. So this was just really to give you an idea that book banning is nothing new. However, in just the past couple of years, really, we see parents, activists, school board officials, lawmakers around the country who are really challenging books at a pace not seen in decades. Just recently, and you are going to actually see as we go through the slide that our references is really a year old and not older than that. So just recently, in January 22nd, piece came out in New York Times reporting that in the fall 2021, it is just past fall, during 3 months period, they were on unprecedented 330 book challenges. And this came out from the American Library Association. They also reported that this was the highest since 1990.
So continuing off on that, what we'd really like to discuss is that one of the issues is that criminal charges can be, there's an effort legislatively around the country to press charges criminally against school librarians for shelving banned books. Also, we see that this is happening at like a highly, as Dr. Haslauer mentioned, this is happening at a rate that is almost unprecedented. It's happening really quickly, and the use of social media as well as growing parental objections are usually based upon selected passages. So what we talk about this is that passages are taken out of context of the books, and then are placed on social media as a form of like perpetuating this sort of like backlash around books. And what we see is that this sort of backlash is occurring as resistance and around diversifying not only the author set and author lists, but also the diversifying the sort of subject matter and content of books being put in schools.
So here I have a slides for you. I could not resist to put that in, and this came out in the news last week. Really, maybe some of you actually have heard that Ketanji Brown Jackson have heard a Supreme Court confirmation hearing, and even in that hearing, banned books became an issue and were brought to forefront. So she was actually asked about 2 books, 2 children books, and what was also interesting, like Dr. Adams mentioned before, that when those 2 books were brought into the conversation, bits and pieces and misinformation were brought about those books, and they were really misrepresented. So you are going to see in the next couple of slides that really this book banning thing is, and putting children's books in the big conversation is really happening today. I have here a couple of books for you. This is really just the tip of the iceberg, but you have here a selection of books that tend to be basically banned in many schools. What kind of books are being censored? Here we have some slide. Dr. Adams is going to introduce that for us.
So Jessica Alcon discussed this sort of idea around what is the most frequently banned and challenged themes over the last decade. So it doesn't reach 100% because many of the books that have been banned are put into multiple categories. So if we look at the top of the 20s through the 45, we see issues around race, LGBTQ+, paraphernalia, sexually explicit, and violence. And again, this comes down to who gets to define what is these issues, or how are these issues being defined?
All right. So the first question, of course, people would ask that who can even ban books? To be honest with you, to me, this topic is super, super interesting because coming from another country and looking at the United States, I never thought that this is a thing here, right? So who can ban books in the United States? So I have here a list of stakeholders in public schools. And so the question is, are they teachers? Are they school librarians? Are they school administrators? The federal government, does the federal government has a role in book banning? Or are we looking at the states and parents? And so what you are going to see that in the past, basically teachers and school librarians and school administrators have the right to decide what are in the school libraries, what are included in the school curriculum and what not. Now, this is basically backed up by the federal government, as we are going to see in the Supreme Court decisions.
So when we look at the Board of Education of Island Trees versus Pico in 1982, just like what Dr. Haslauer says, is that the school boards have the discretion over school affairs. So it's at a very localized level. And so the idea around it is that the decisions must reflect the First Amendment and not be based on partisan politics. There is still a sort of a glimpse of how this is going to explode by saying that if the books are pervasively vulgar, then they can be removed.
However, just recently, we see an increased role of the states in deciding what books can be given to children and what not. So states really gained new power just in the past few years about decision making. And in the next couple of slides, we are going to explain for you those state legislations that severely restrict teachers, school librarians, and school administrators about what books can be given to children.
So before, with the Island Trees versus Pico in 1982, when the school boards are making the decisions, we see here with Iowa House Bill 2176 is that this hasn't gone through the Senate yet, but what is initially proposed is that criminal penalties can be imposed upon teachers and school librarians that are using materials that the Iowa government does not feel to be deemed fit for students in the classroom. So again, like the criminal penalties is there, and that has not been there before.
It is another law that came out just recently. This is actually being enforced just in January 7, 2020. This is from Idaho House Bill, and this is what it says. So they used to have in Idaho a law which basically prohibited the distribution of harmful materials to children. But to this law, there was an exception. And the exception was that basically teachers, libraries, schools, and so forth can introduce all sorts of materials to students, because sometimes something that is harmful out of the context of education, it is actually important in the context of education. So what this Idaho House Bill did in January, basically removed the exemptions, and now nobody can distribute some harmful materials, something that is considered to be harmful. So if you think about that, this is actually a very tricky thing, because we already talked about it, that what does it constitute to be harmful is questionable. Who makes that decision? So I'm going to give you an example how that might actually look like at a classroom level. So think about, many of you know the story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was brutally murdered during the Jim Crow era, and his picture, his dead body was widely circulated to actually educate people about the cruelties of the Jim Crow laws and what were happening even in the 1950s in the South. So when you're looking at that image, which is really a brutally beaten up face, right? Someone can make the argument that this is actually harmful for children outside of the context of explaining of what that actually meant. In the previous law, you could use that image to teach, say, high schoolers about the Jim Crow law. Today, you cannot do that. So when you are thinking about this particular law, it severely restricts the school curriculum, what can be taught for children and what not, and pretty much everything could be looked at as being harmful.
So similarly, a Senate bill that came through Oklahoma's legislation on February 7th in 2022 prohibits school districts from having students have access to books that discuss sex in a non-heteronormative way. So anything discussing LGBTQ plus, anything discussing gender fluidity, those books carry a penalty if they're to be housed in the school library of $10,000. This is, and so not only that, but it also penalizes the librarians for having LGBTQ plus books, gender fluidity books, sexual preference books, that the employee or the school librarian or the teacher cannot be employed as a teacher in the state of Oklahoma for 2 years. So the penalties are really, really harsh.
Yeah. And so for you to understand how that looks like on a classroom level, so what does it mean for school teachers? So think about if you would have a child who comes from a lesbian couple, or a mom and mom, or dad and dad, and so forth. So, and then this school teacher would like to be inclusive and would like to give material, reading material for all children about families who are not just mom and baba, maybe something different. The school teacher, based on this law, could not include any kind of books in the school because could be penalized. Yeah. Anything? Okay.
So we'd really like to take some time to look at Tennessee's House Bill 580 and Senate Bill 623, which was introduced in May and ratified in May of 2021, because it really does set an outline for other states such as Texas, Indiana, that are thinking about passing similar legislation. So in this bill, the bill initially was set up to talk about sort of teacher preparation credit requirements, sort of what was adequate teacher preparation for teaching of reading, and the evaluation of programs. And yet, embedded in the bill is this amendment that is a direct response to the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, that discusses any sort of issues around meritocracy being inherently racist or sexist, that the state of the United States is fundamentally irredeemably racist or sexist. And so the idea here is that any sort of ideas that may have any sort of relationship to critical race theory are deemed as being equivalent with the idea around promoting or advocating the violent throw of the United States government. And so
again, going back to the idea, what does that mean in terms of classroom or for classroom teachers? This is very much restricting any kind of discussions that lead to racism. So I give you an example. You are a fourth grade teacher, and the student would ask you, teacher, how come that we never had a female president in the United States? Based on this law, you cannot give an explanation that is based on sexism. Based on this law, you have to make sure that the students understand that meritocracy means that whoever succeeds in the United States succeed because of talent and effort. And we know that this is simply not true. We know that we don't have female presidents in the United States because of the deeply rooted sexism of this country. But simply you cannot have that discussion in the classroom anymore in Oklahoma with children.
And so the question then becomes, what does Tennessee allow? And so they provide a lengthy and often a language that is archaic to restrict access to not only the bill, but also the sort of legalese process as well. But what they allow is this sort of idea around an impartial discussion of history. Well, history is always history for. The historian has their own sets of biases, is placed within a historical context and has access to only the materials that they have access to. To say that it's totally impartial would be an illusion or a total fantasy that Tennessee is describing. What is really interesting here is that they say described in textbooks. And for Tennessee, the sort of connection between Pearson and McGraw-Hill and other textbook companies, there's a sort of unsavory connection with what is being taught in schools and the textbook companies themselves. So what are the stakes in Tennessee? So the stakes in Tennessee, well, we talked about in Oklahoma that there's a $10,000 fine for the individual that offers books of LGBTQ+ and gender fluidity. In Tennessee, anything that relates to race and sexism carries a huge penalty that proliferates throughout the ecosystem of not only the school, but also the community as well, in the sense that it can withhold state funds from the school. So if we think about the way that school funding works, there's funding from the federal government, the state government, and also the local government. And so withholding one of those legs can really drastically impact the school in a really negative way. So the stakes are incredibly high.
So what's also interesting in the country just very recently that these kind of state legislations are not unique to Tennessee. So here is an example. This is from Texas House bill that was passed about half years ago in June. And this very much resembles the language of the Tennessee House bill. So basically it has that no teacher or administrator or employee could teach the following concept. You have race, sex inherently superior to another race or sex. Number two would be that racism could be subconscious. We are talking here about implicit biases, and we know that in racism, implicit biases is a big issue. But according to that, in Texas, you cannot teach that. You also cannot teach basically anything that relates to racism, race, sex, and so forth that might create some kind of a discomfort or guilt in children. And again, we will go back to the issue, who is going to decide what that actually means in real life. And here comes again meritocracy. And this is again very similar to the issue that we saw already in Tennessee. I would like to show you here how that actually looks like again on ground in classrooms. So this is here from Carroll Independent School District in Texas. And basically when this Texas state law came out, the school district decided to create a rubric based on which every book in the school will be evaluated, whether it can remain in the library or in the school curriculum or not. So when you're looking at this rubric, there are different standards. And if you're looking at standard not met, any of those, if applies for the book, would mean that the book has to go. So I would like to show you here this particular aspect, which means that the book is going to get a 0 if the book represents a singular dominant narrative in such a way that it cannot be balanced with other materials, may be considered offensive. Now, on the surface level, this kind of makes sense. But when you start to apply that for certain books, then basically this rubric is going to fall apart, and basically this is just simply kills multicultural education. So let me show you two particular books that typically are targeted, and I'm going to show you why those two books never would make, and books like that never would make the curriculum or a school library. So here is the first one. Separate is never equal. This is about Sylvia Mendes. So many of you know her story. So she grew up during the segregation before 1954. Way before that, before separate is equal was unconstitutional. And so she was from a Hispanic family who was denied education in a white school. The parents wanted her to go to a white school because the education was that better, to give the child better opportunities. And so basically this book tells children that particular story. Now, if you think about this book, never will make the selections because of that rubric. Number one, because think about how in the world can you balance this particular book with some kind of another perspective. There is no other perspective for that. But even if you don't go to that rubric, this book never would make the library shelves, because in Texas, as we mentioned before, you cannot actually teach the idea that meritocracy is ingrained in racism and sexism. And if you think about this whole book is about giving equal opportunities for children. A meritocracy works only if everybody has the equal chance. Then we can say that if you succeed, you are succeeding for talent and effort. But if people don't even have the opportunity in the first place, then kind of meritocracy fall apart. So based on the argument, if you cannot teach meritocracy in the context of racism and sexism, this book is simply out. Here is a second book that, just to give you an example of how that law actually, again, looks like. So The Hate You Give, many of you probably are familiar with the story. This is about police brutality. This is about a Black young adult who was killed in a police shooting, and it basically tells this story. It is in a Black neighborhood, right? So again, going back to our rubric, we can actually see here that this book never would make that school district library, because again, how can you balance the story of police brutality with another perspective? But then when you go back to the law, and the law states you cannot teach implicit bias, right? It's also going to enforce that this book cannot be taught, because oftentimes police brutality is based on implicit bias, and this is very clear in that particular book. So you probably also hear that in Texas, there was a school district where our teachers wanted to teach about the Holocaust. And basically the superintendent said, well, if you teach the Holocaust, you have to balance it out with a second view. And then the question becomes again, how can you do that, right? So the result is you are not teaching the Holocaust, because there is no reasonable person who would actually teach the opposing view of Holocaust, whatever that would mean. So the question then becomes, what can stay in the library shelves in those states where these laws are becoming reality? And basically the answer for that is really only those books that reinforce dominant ideologies and discourses.
So what this turns into is that this sort of idea around Texas and the Texas House of Representatives with this, it's kind of bubbled to the surface with Matt Cruz's Cruz List, which it mirrors McCarthyism, but almost is much more nefarious in the sense that it lists a certain number of books written mainly by women, authors of color, queer authors, and books with LGBTQ plus themes and characters to be banned from school libraries. And so Mary Woodward, who is the president-elect of the Texas Library Association, says that, who's been a librarian for over 35 years, says she's never seen anything like this. So going back to the slides at the beginning of the presentation, this is happening at a rate that is exponentially much more rapid and much more nefarious as well.
And so if you are thinking is, okay, fine, those are mostly southern states, right? Well, except maybe Idaho. But what does it mean for Midwestern states like Wisconsin? So here is the thing, maybe some of you have heard that, but we actually have similar bill introduced and actually passed by the Assembly just a couple months ago. And basically in Wisconsin, this law states that schools would be prohibited to teach systemic racism. schools should not teach issues of racism or sexism that might make students feel guilty. So you can see here again the guilty concept coming back again. Meritocracy, once again, schools cannot teach that meritocracy is racist and sexist. And then also, once again, there is the penalty, just like in other states. So if schools would violate these rules, then the state can actually withhold 10% of aid. And we know, and probably you know if you are from Wisconsin schools, with all the referendums that many schools are actually struggling financially. So now this bill this is still not reality because of very likely Governor Evers not going to sign it into law. However, in the fall, we will have a new election. And then so whoever going to be a new governor would actually take this on, and this very easily could be reality in Wisconsin schools as well. What does that mean for Wisconsin children? So in Wisconsin, we have several other laws that are actually important in terms of teaching multicultural education and to help to incorporate diversity within our schools. So we have Act 31. Many of you already know Act 31. Act 31 in Wisconsin requires the instruction of history of the 11 federally recognized tribes and bands of Wisconsin, right? So if a law like that would be introduced and accepted in Wisconsin, how can teachers teach Act 31? How can teachers teach the Ho-Chunk removal, for example? How can teachers teach the boarding schools, the Indian boarding schools that were so devastated for many of our tribal members? And also, if you think about Indian boarding schools are as racist as it can be, kill the Indian in order to save the man, right? So this is going to be a problem at that level. There is also a contradiction with another law, and that is Act 30. Act 30 is a law that was passed just in this past year, which basically requires all Wisconsin schools the instruction of the Holocaust and at least one other genocide. If you cannot teach about racism, right, then how can you teach this concept for students? So the point to make here is that this is not the case in Wisconsin just yet, but whatever Texas and Tennessee did to schools could very easily be reality for many of your future classrooms as well, those of you who are going to be teachers.
So we have isolated, this is nothing, the arguments that are reactionary against diversifying books in school curriculums and also school libraries boil down to four main ideas. And these are essentially the sort of ideas around childhood that Philip Arias talked about in his book, Centuries of Childhood in 1962. And the first one is that schools, books, materials should not make children feel uncomfortable or guilty. And this also, the idea around this is that childhood is a secular or a special time, not secular time, a special time in somebody's life, and that that time is not given back, and so they should not feel guilty or uncomfortable. Similar, that this sort of idea of innocence should be preserved as long as possible, and in order to do that, you need to shelter children from obscenity and should not be indoctrinated.
So we are going to go through every one of them, and we are going to actually see how, again, those examples look like in real life. So the first one is making children feel uncomfortable. So this came out from Education Week, again, just last fall. So basically what happened here is in Central York School District in Pennsylvania. What they did is they pulled a long list of books featuring Black characters from the shelves. And some of these books actually featured racism. Some of them were not even about racism. It was just simply about Black experiences. And so basically, many of the white parents, they will say, yeah, of course we want to do that because we don't want to make our white children feel uncomfortable reading those type of books. But then of course, in that particular school district, not all children were white. In fact, there were some black parents. And then so they actually raised the question, okay, so you are making decisions based on white children outcomes, but what about my children? And so what are ways in which my children can see themselves in the curriculum? Why is that my children don't have the right to read books and get access to books in the school curriculum, in the school library that they can actually relate to? I have here a book that kind of shows how the books would look like. So maybe some of you actually know Monday is Not Coming Back. This is for young adults, and basically this is an experience of a black girl who has a friend and the friend disappears, and then she's the only one who takes that seriously, and she tries to draw the adults' attention that Monday is gone and nobody kind of wonders or seems, and so basically it becomes a crime, and so the story is about that. And even in Pennsylvania schools, books like that would be banned from schools because of the argument that this is not reflecting white children. Notice here just how much white privilege and white supremacy is at play. Who is being considered? Whose needs are being considered? The majority, the whites, and everyone else is not important.
So the second argument is around preserving children's innocence. And the reality is that, so we think about Finetti's argument is that books, diverse books have the ability to allow students to empathize, especially when difficult situations arise in the book, that it can help students navigate difficult situations in their own lives.
So here is an example about the snowflower and the secret fan. This is a book that is banned in many school districts. This is basically also written for young adults or even adults. I mean, this is just a fantastic book. It is in 19th century China. It is about foot binding, but basically the story is about two girls. They are very good friends, and then how they become adults, and basically their life story. And so it's a beautifully written piece, but the book is talking about bad business, which refers, of course, to sexuality. There's two girls trying to figure out who they are, and then, of course, how they become adults and how they become women, and what does it mean to be a woman in the 19th century China. And then, of course, you can see lots of examples of sexism. This is a book that young women, adolescent women, young students could very much relating to. They can see sexism in our own society. They can relate to those two child's experiences, but because of the legislations that are coming out from the state, books like that cannot be used in schools. Here is another reason, and that's kind of relates a little bit to that, and this is sheltering children from obscenity. So this is a very interesting argument what people who are doing book banning making. And on the surface level, of course, we don't want children to have access to obscenity. But the question is, like Dr. Adams mentioned before, who has the right to decide what is obscene and what is not? How is that being defined? And this is what many of the research is actually finding. That is oftentimes obscenity is equal to anything that is about exploring sexuality. And we know that teenagers want to explore sexuality. This is part of a human experience, right? But many people would actually label that obscene, and then so they would take out books from the libraries. Most importantly, oftentimes what is obscene is equal with the Krauss list, LGBTQ plus expression, immediately explicit or adult-like, even though some of them has actually nothing to do with offensiveness. Some of these LGBTQ experiences actually are non-sexual. But because of the ways we look at LGBT people in this society, immediately the topic, boom, equal with obscenity. You probably have heard in the news not that long ago, Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who basically made the parallel between pornographic books, and then so he basically used pornographic images as an umbrella term for everything that has had to do with sexuality. And notice here again that he also suggested that those people who are giving student books about some sexually explicit messages have to go under criminal investigation. So when you're looking at these things, the stake for teachers and librarians is really, really high. I would like to show you just something, and that is talking about sexuality. We are very much aware that we don't want to do that, but in a way, we actually teaching sexuality right from the beginning. So many of you probably have grown up with the Cinderella story, right? It is a love story. It is about a sexual relationship. It is about a heterosexual relationship. And very few people who are writing those laws would take out a book like that from the libraries. This is something widely accepted. But this is problematic, right? If you think about the second book, is nothing else than the Cinderella story. The only difference is that we have here a same-sex couple. It's not more sexually explicit. It's not more obscene. The story is exactly the same, but it is labeled as such because you are talking about outside the heteronormativity.
And the last is the indoctrination idea. And so if we look to our friends at Webster's dictionary, they say the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically is indoctrination. So Ibram X. Kendi's work with Jason Reynolds, the Stand for Kids, Stand for Adolescents, and Stand from the Beginning is not indoctrination because they ask us to think critically about our nation's past. So it's totally the opposite of indoctrination. And the idea around being able to think critically about our past is the purpose of education. And so the citizenry that is educated helps benefit all of us, right?
So what are the consequences when we are looking into the future? Are there more book banning? There is from Washington Post, a piece came out just literally like last week. And basically that states that we have now a new practice in schools, and that is administrators. Remember in the beginning of this presentation, we said that schools, administrators, they had the right to decide what books are in the curriculum, the school libraries. And now what we are seeing that those administrators are so afraid about controversies and not being supported by state laws. They basically quietly removing books before they could be even challenged. But we also have seen, based on that report, that librarians are basically censoring themselves. They do exactly the same thing. They're actually looking at those books that have been challenged by certain groups, and basically they don't even recommend those books for buying or ordering, because again, the stake is very, very high. That means that they could be criminally charged if they would have access to those books for children. So with all that,
with this sort of violence against a multicultural cosmopolitan set of authors and topics, what are we left with? We're left with an equally, or if not more violent set of books that privilege white, male, heterosexual, native-born perspectives that reinforce white supremacy, racism, sexism, heterosexism, and nativism.
And this is in a context of the United States where the demographic shift is huge, right? We have many, many students in schools who are none of these. And imagine that books available for them are just like that, and they are simply not represented in the curriculum. And with that, we would like to open up if you have any questions for us. So if you want to put that in the chat, I don't know if you can actually speak out, but if anybody has any questions, we are happy to answer.
Yeah, and if you wanted to verbalize a question, you can use the raise your hand feature and we can go ahead and manually unmute you in. So feel free to do that or enter questions into the chat. Do either of you have recommendations for how to counteract some of this stuff, especially when it's coming in at a legislative level?
At the legislation level, it's really about people voting who are there. But there was actually some recommendation at the school district level, and that is much of the book banning comes from parents and pushing certain books and pushing the idea that certain books should be removed. And also what we have seen is that many parents don't actually read the whole book, but we talked about social media. So social media is creating fear, and then the parents don't actually know the book, but go to the school and then pushing the idea to pulling back out. And so if the school has actually a policy said that you can challenge a book, but then there has to be a process, there has to be a discussion, then typically eliminate the push from the parents to pulling books off from the shelves. So, because really, if you think about those state laws are good only as long as somebody is challenging them, right? State laws could be state laws if nobody challenging the schools and the schools' decisions to using books, then it's never actually going to go to the court. So it's really working with the parents and making sure that parents understand that some of those books have very strong literary values is pretty much the, could be a solution.
Thank you, Edina. We had two questions come in the chat. The first is, so I know Books A Million in Dubuque, Iowa has a banned book section. Is this something that might change or be punished in the near future?
I would have to say, I don't know, because we really looked at only state laws that affecting schools and school libraries. But since this is out of the context of schools, I am not sure. Dr. Adams?
I don't think it's within, like, outside the realm of possibility in the near future. That maybe that's just totally pessimistic on my end. But I think that goes into the next question, which is pushback. So the idea around reactionary policies such as these that were coming from Texas or Tennessee, we do see that the pushback is happening. So there were several Texas professors that were really pushing back against the state laws in Texas, and especially around, because it was also tailored to or tethered to tenure policies as well. But also in Tennessee, I try to keep the finger on the pulse in Chattanooga. That's a community that I taught in, and I really have close ties to, or try to have close ties with as well. And there's a lot of pushback there was a lot of pushback and discussions at the local school board meetings, pushback from the Chattanooga legislatures on House Bill 580, Senate Bill 623. I know I wrote the governor and my the Congress people that used to represent me. And I think that goes back to what Dr. Haslauer says, is that just it's put pressure on the legislators, fill their inbox with letters that are thoughtful and engaging, that really kind of push back against this reactionary force.
And maybe I just would like to add something more like to the first question in terms of banned books. There has been also some literature looking at recent and older book banning, and there is a counter reaction. So every time the school bans a book, people seem to be super interested about. So I have come across with that idea, so I did the research, is that books are sitting on the bookshelves getting dust, collecting dust, and immediately somebody draws the attention to this book, then everybody wants to have that. So in a way, it kind of can backfire in that way, in that respect. There was also other interesting issue we didn't talk about here, and that is, should there be a list that is like kind of like in films, you have like ratings, and would that be useful? And basically the idea here is many people would say no, because then who is going to make make the decision? And people are just starting to be biased against those books without even knowing what the books are entailing. So there was an interesting things that sort of came out, or I came across with this idea as I was doing that research.
Someone also asked, are there laws affecting all levels of education?
So this is basically K-12. Yeah.
But I do think but I do think in Texas there is momentum to because there is attack against teacher tenure, and I think that could also be coupled with what materials being taught, what books are being taught, and who gets to continue to labor as a professor.
Thank you, Kaden. So my name is Willow, I work in the marketing department at Platteville. My fun banned book story is when I was in 12th grade English, my AP English teacher slid us a list of banned books and was like, if you read one and write a report, you get extra credit. That made me an English major, and I got a master's in literature, all because of her giving us that banned book list. So it's very important because it also titillated us. We were a little bit curious. So I'm here for it.
This is so interesting that you're actually mentioning that, because as I was reading different things that actually came up too. And what's super interesting that students usually love these books. So this is not the argument is we have to perceive or keep kids innocent, and it makes students feel guilty. And that doesn't seem to be the truth. Children want to explore these issues. It's more like coming up from the parents who try to protect their children for whatever reason, for the different reasons we mentioned before. But students love these books. All right, so this is the cat. I'm sorry.
Dr. Haslauer, you didn't tell us you had an assistant with you today.
Yes, she is Dusty, and she is the apple of my eye.
Love it. Awesome. Well, please feel free to do the raise hand feature or add in any last minute questions. Otherwise, we'll wrap up here in a minute. I really appreciate you all being here and joining us on our last session today. And thank you, Dr. Haslauer, Dr. Adams, for being here and sharing your expertise. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Dusty cares too.
Dusty, yeah.